hello everybody. This is the first of our seminars of this term, Real Centre seminars of this term, and this one was actually postponed from last term, so thank you very much to our colleagues from VVOB, who we'll be hearing from in a moment, for agreeing to this new time. We're really excited to be hearing more about your work. As people could see as you've been coming in, we are recording this. We don't always record, so just to alert you that we're recording, and hopefully that is okay with everybody. So we've been having ongoing discussions with colleagues from VVOB for a number of years together with the Real Centre, and so it's really exciting to have this opportunity to hear more about VVOB's work in a particular context and on a particular topic that is obviously of quite high significance, and one that's getting a lot of discussion internationally at the moment around teaching at the right level. And this one is with a focus on Zambia. But I think one thing that we have been particularly privileged to be involved in discussions with VVOB is around the importance of evidence, so the importance that VVOB gives to evidence to help inform and shape their programme. And I think sort of the link between how implementation, practitioner work and evidence needs to really work closely together. So we were very pleased to be able to write a blog together, I think it was a year or two ago now, with VVOB to sort of identify the importance of this and how perhaps we as researchers, I think that's definitely sort of made me reflect on how we as researchers could do some of this better. So Sandra has put that link in the chat. So this seminar today is on how the Zambian education system and partners are using evidence for accelerated learning, experience of teaching at the right level. So as I said, this is actually bringing a really concrete example to what was in that blog. And we're very pleased to be hearing from Anne-Thora, Vardoy-Mutale and Jeff Peeraer, who are going to be speaking. Well, Anne-Thora is going to be speaking about this in particular. Jeff will come in towards the end, and we, as usual, will have plenty of time for discussion. So we hope to have about half an hour for discussion. If you have any questions of clarification or comments you want to put in the chat in the meantime, please do so, but also be ready with your questions at the end. So Anne-Thora, over to you.
Thank you so much, Pauline Rose, for that lovely introduction. And this presentation assumes that there's no familiarity with the TARL methodology. So I'll quickly look at that first, and then we'll get into the particulars of what's happening in Zambia. So I was thanking Pauline Rose for the lovely introduction, and we'll head straight in. What we are seeing in Zambia is that at grade 5, the performance of learners in standardized government tests is on average 34 out of 100 points, which is quite similar to what we're seeing in other countries in the sub-Saharan African region. And even though enrollment is at an all-time high, it's not really translating into learning. Next slide, please. So when you look at our Catchup specific data, so the data that we collect during our assessments in the TARL methodology and in Catchup in Zambia, we do have a number of assessment points throughout the year. We currently have 3. So when we do the baseline, typically in January, and I've included here data from pre-COVID, so up to 2019, this largely confirms the picture and the story of the learning crisis in sub-Saharan Africa and in Zambia in particular. So if you look at this data, this is from southern and eastern provinces, you see that just about 1/3 of the learners are able to read in grade 3, 4, and 5. So this data is combining grade 3, 4, and 5. And if you look at these top 2 categories, para and story, you see that that is about 1/3 of the learners who are able to read sentences or text at grade 1 or 2 level. You find the other 1/3 in the middle in the letter and word categories, where they're able to recognize letters, not necessarily read words, or can read words but not read sentences for meaning. And then you have the last 1/3 at the bottom where they actually cannot recognize letters as yet. So as you can see, the distribution of the learning levels is quite varied, and the overall reading levels are of course low. And for numeracy, we see that the situation is similar, if not worse. So the challenge becomes, who should the teacher teach? What should be taught? How do you structure a lesson? How do you work with a classroom that looks like this? And of course, very often this leads to teaching to the top of the class rather than in teaching each individual learner. Now, if I can get the next slide. When we do introduce catch-up lessons, remedial learning lessons that are 1 hour a day, we see that actually we are able to change this picture quite quickly though, because what we do is that based on these assessments, the children are grouped into learning levels. So it's not by age or grade, and it's not in a full class setup. It's with very different activities. There's a lot of learning through play. There's a lot of interaction. There's a lot of engaging the kids in games that are structured, and that way we are able to change the scenario quite quickly. So this is the data from the same provinces. You see the top one with the baseline is the data we just looked at together. This is for 2019, with 1/3 at the bottom, 1/3 in the middle, and 1/3 on top. And after about 6 months of implementation, so from January to July, we can see a shift. So you see that over half, so about 56% of learners are able to read a paragraph or story. And you see that we only have 9% at the bottom unable to recognize letters, with the remainder, in the middle, somewhere close to breaking through to reading. And of course, the grade 5s are ahead of the grade 3/4s. So with this combined data, by the time these learners are leaving grade 5, most of them would have broken through to literacy. We saw similar results for numeracy as well. So this means that even though you have a fairly challenging situation, with the TARL methodology and catch-up classes, you're able to see quite a quick shift by allocating this dedicated time to foundational skills. And of course, using the data, using the assessment actively in this process. Next slide, please. So what we are trying to do is really to have a paradigm shift of, not just focusing education for winners, but moving towards an education system where all children are learning well. Next slide. And this might look simple, but it's quite difficult to get education systems to change the culture and change the teaching style and really focus on engaging each individual child in a classroom. Next slide, please. In terms of evidence, when we talk about evidence for TARL, we do have evidence for the methodology itself, proven across a number of contexts. We've had about 8 RCTs. We have got 1 RCT coming up in Zambia next year. But also when you do compare the TARL methodology to other interventions that have been evaluated, you find that TARL seems to coming out as the most effective basic skills intervention, and also one of the most cost-effective as well, and one that is easy to embed within existing government systems. So I'm sure the audience is quite, familiar with a lot of the input-based, interventions like textbooks, reducing class sizes, laptops, flip charts. But what we see is that TARL has been proven to be far more effective, and the input-based interventions very often favor the already well-performing students, whereas TARL actually favors the lower-performing students compared to the others. Next slide, please. So TARL in Africa started in Zambia and has now spread to over 10 countries in the region. Next slide. And next slide again. So if you look at the map of Zambia, it tells the story of Catchup. So basically the Catchup program in Zambia was initiated by the Ministry of Education back in 2016, when they acknowledged the learning crisis and started looking for solutions. They came across the TARL methodology in India, pioneered by Pratham, an Indian NGO, and they thought this seems like something that might work for our context. And there was a learning journey. They quickly managed to get funding for a pilot, and due to the results of that pilot, USAID, UNICEF, Ministry, JPAL, and VVOB partnered for scaling in southern and eastern provinces. So fast forward, 6 years, we have covered all schools in southern and eastern province. We have covered all schools in Lusaka province. We have partial coverage in the yellow ones here, and we have funding for Luapula and Central Province to cover all provinces as well. And so you can see we are actually having this program in 8 out of 10 provinces in Zambia and in about a third of primary schools in the country. So that is the scale that we are at, and we have been able to see consistent results despite the increasing scale, which I'll show very soon. Next slide, please. So in a nutshell, how does the Catchup program, or how does the implementation model look like in Zambia? Basically, we target grades 3, 4, and 5, and they are grouped by learning level based on the assessment. So this is one way that data is used in, immediately to inform the program. We typically have ages 8 to 12. It's delivered by a ministry-employed school teachers. It's delivered outside of the regular hours. A normal school day in primary school in Zambia is typically 3 hours. And the catch-up class will come before or after those 3 regular hours. In the past, we used to implement, 2 out of 3 terms. At the moment, after COVID, the ministry has asked to also include the 3rd term, which is the examination term, which is a busy one, but they see the value of catch-up in the country's recovery from the COVID school closures and accelerated learning to be a priority, and as such, we are now running catch-up classes throughout the year. We alternate literacy and numeracy, so you might do literacy Monday, Tuesday, numeracy Wednesday, Friday, or a whole week on numeracy if you find that that's where you have a challenge. So this again is all informed by the data at the school level, and the timetabling is also informed by that. We have 3 assessment points. Ideally, you would want to do one at the beginning and end of each term, but the assessments are considered a burden to the teachers. And so the ministry has negotiated to have as few as possible. So we currently have, February, May, and October, whereas in the past we had January, April, July. Materials, we keep it very light because we want it to be as affordable and sustainable as possible. So we mainly have printed teacher guides showing the activities, and all the other materials are locally made by teachers. As you can see in the pictures here, you have teachers preparing, sticks for counting for the numeracy lesson. You've got, teachers preparing syllable cards to use in a literacy lesson. And so we really try to use locally available resources to make teaching and learning aids. Next slide, please. You can click all the way through on this one to get everything showing. Thank you. So this is just an example of what an assessment tool would look like in English, though we do administer this in local languages, and Zambia has 7 official languages. And so we try to use the provincial languages, or, the language the child is familiar with. But of course, with Zambia having 72 unofficial languages, it means that some children are indeed learning in a 2nd or 3rd language. But it is all in local language for now, and we haven't yet started experimenting with English, though that might be interesting in a context like the capital city. So this is a theoretical assessment tool, and you see here that you can start from the words and then you go down to letters if they can't read a word, or you go up to a sentence, paragraph, or story level. So that's how simple it is. And it's a one-on-one assessment, which takes about 2 minutes per child. And we have a similar one for numeracy, with addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. And they're all quite quick. And this gives the teachers a unique opportunity to actually understand each child in their classroom and understand which level they are and, where they are struggling. We often say that a written test just assesses whether a child can read and understand a question and reply to that question, respond to that question in writing. Whereas with this verbal assessment based on the ASAT tool, we find that you get a lot more actionable information. So this is used for grouping. And then, of course, it's used to select activities that are appropriate for that level and for the composition of learners in that level. Even the timetabling in terms of how many beginner groups do you set up, how many teachers do you deploy on each level. All that is informed by the data you get from the assessments at the school. Children, can learn in groups, individually, whole class, there's a whole mixture. And as soon as they acquire the skills needed for a particular level, you progress them and move them to the next group. So there's nothing like being stuck in a level. You know, as soon as you are able to master the skills needed there, you are moved on. And we use the similar assessments for tracking the progress informally, but also formally 3 times a year. Next slide, please. And the next section is on results. I've got a pretty packed table here, but I will show it also with some visuals in the next few slides. But if you see our historical data from 2016, you see these percentages, you know, in terms of from the baseline to the end line. If we just look at 2019, we saw that at the beginning of the year, this is the data we looked at together. You had about 35% of children reading. And by July, you had about 56%, which is a 21 percentage point increase. And same for subtraction, you had 27% of learners able to subtract in January, 51% by July. And this is combined data from grades 3 to 5. In 2020, with the school closures, of course, there was a bit of a drop. We saw some stagnation and in some cases a drop. So there's a lot of, that's a whole lecture on its own in terms of the COVID year. In 2021, we saw some normalization. We had a number of school closures, but not as long. And we saw that we were able to achieve similar improvements in learning outcomes. You can pull up the next slide, please. What we've seen is that as we increase our scale, the baselines tend to go down. However, what we see that is the lower the baseline, most often the larger the improvement. So if you show the next slide, you see that when we started off with fairly good baselines, we had, you know, not so much of an improvement, but when we see the baseline going down, we see the improvements actually going up. And in Lusaka province, we had some districts with actually 20% of learners able to read at the beginning of the year, and we managed to push that to, in some cases, 50–60%. But this is an average, this is based on our average results from all the provinces. You can go to the next slide as well. And this is similar for numeracy. You see the baselines are going down over time. This is most likely because we are reaching more remote schools and we are going, you know, into covering all schools in a province, including those that are very hard to reach. But it could also be telling us something about the general learning levels in the country. And I think especially after COVID, we are looking into whether those school closures have had a long-term effect. Next slide, please. But even for numeracy, we've been able to see our increase going up. Next slide, please. In terms of the data flow and use, this is a very packed slide, but I think it summarizes what we've been talking about, because in Zambia, you have a structure of the central level, then you have the provincial level, then you have the district level, and then you've got something called a zone, which is basically just a lead school that oversees maybe 10 schools in that area, where you have a teacher and a head teacher that have some extra responsibilities assigned to them. And these are typically our master trainers or our mentors. And so the way that the data, you know, is collected and flows, you find that it's all, you know, on paper at the school level, and then it's fed up to the zonal level. So at the school level, as mentioned, it's used to group the learners, it's used for timetabling, it's used to inform the selection of activities, it's helping the schools to track progress and really tailor-make their catch-up program to that particular school. When the data is submitted to the zone, there is some element of quality checking here. There's review, there's feedback given to the schools, and then this data is entered online. We've just created a data entry portal last year. And so now this data is coming online. In the past, it was going, you know, on email with Excel sheets. So we keep improving on our data systems. But this data, more importantly than being submitted upwards, it informs the coaching and mentoring efforts by the zonal mentors. So it's really a real-time picture of what's happening in the schools that fall under that zone, and it's used actively to reach out. When this comes to the district and provincial level, you see again that there's this review, quality checks, approval of the data in the system, but also a bit of analysis and, you know, what can explain the differences between zones and districts. You know, why are some performing better than others? Why are some behind? If you have 300 schools in a district and only 200 submitted data, you know, what's happening to that remaining 100 schools? You might want to go and check whether they are in fact delivering the catch-up program at all. or whether they have been struggling to put up those lessons. So even at this level, the data will inform the monitoring, mentoring, and in some cases, even administrative decisions, because when you see a school or a zone that is consistently underperforming, it might tell you something about the staffing level, about the need to retrain, or maybe it's a budget issue. And sometimes, the district would then organize refresher trainings or mentoring visits or coaching to those that are struggling, and maybe inviting those that are from well-performing zones or schools to come and facilitate together with master trainers. There are also review meetings at every level. So at the school, they review their data. At the zone, you have a zonal review where they have maybe those 10 schools that are together. And at the district level, you have a review meeting where you are, with all the zones in a district, and in a province, you have a review meeting with all the districts. So these are very important opportunities, where issues can be brought out, challenges, successes, best practices, solutions to challenges. So these are very, very vibrant meetings where the intervention is discussed in great detail and where solutions are found and where you really can, put a story and a narrative to the data. At the central level, the ministry has a final review of the data and also, some analysis, which can again inform administrative decisions as well as their monitoring. And at this point, they will be looking more at the district by district data or even province by province data.
So 5 minutes, Anne-Thora. Okay,
that's fine. And the data again informs decisions about expansion. And there's a lot of focus on, how best do we integrate all of this into existing systems. Next slide, please. So some of the key lessons from Zambia, would be that at the core of Catchup in Zambia is really the integration in and delivery through government systems. We think that the success is due to the up-to-date data, being able to demonstrate impact or results as you implement, but also the integration in ministry systems and structures to the point where Catchup was really prioritized as the method for accelerated learning after the post-COVID reopening of schools. It is, of course, costly to introduce. So the initial investment you have to make is the training of the Ministry of Education at all levels. With mentoring and coaching to really establish the program, consolidate it in the early phase. But thereafter, it can easily be sustained by the ministry through pre-service and in-service training combined with government monitoring and mentoring. And we do see this in some of our mature provinces, that they're able to organize trainings on their own without external support, and that they're able to do quite a lot of the coaching and mentoring on their own. So once you have that initial investment as you are expanding, you make sure that the program grows roots, is consolidated. The sustaining piece is a bit lighter, but there's always, of course, need to have a dedicated team. Next slide. We have a few research plans. This is my last slide before I hand over to Jeff. We have some research plans this year. As I mentioned, we'll have a randomized impact evaluation that we'll conduct in central and western provinces in 2023. And we are starting the pilot just about now. And here we'll be testing, the regular catch-up program versus no catch-up, but also we'll be trying to test an enhanced package that we are calling Catchup Plus versus the regular catch-up and no catch-up. So this will be interesting, and I'm sure we'll be happy to share those findings when they are ready. Then with support from the Lego Foundation, we are doing some research on learning through play and social-emotional learning as well in Lusaka province, where we are really trying to discover whether TARL or Catchup contributes to social-emotional learning in children. And we are doing some learning labs in Lusaka province as well, where we are testing tweaks to the TARL methodology in about 20 schools to see if having maybe neighborhood groups or other ways of grouping in the classroom might change the learning outcomes and the like. So we continuously try to generate new evidence and learn and see how we can improve. And thank you so much. I'll leave the last slide for Jeff.
Yeah, I was fortunate to go to see Catchup in action at the end of last year, and I added a couple of reflections based on that visit at that time that speak to the topic of the use of data, and that can also kind of kick off a Q&A session afterwards. So there were 3 points, and the most one and perhaps most obvious one is that there is a strong evidence base, and evidence is being generated also in Zambia. There are 3 data points. There is a baseline, midline, endline assessment for each cohort, you could say, and this data consistently, as you have also seen in the presentation, shows positive impact at the level of the learning outcomes. As important, we see, and my observation also is that this data is being used in relatively short feedback loops at various levels within the education system. So going from the school over the districts to the central level, and also as an answer a bit to one of the questions on incentives and motivation of stakeholders to participate. This use of the data and the shorter feedback loops and to see that there is positive impact really is a key element in the ownership and in the intrinsic motivation, actually, in the approach to take it up. And the final comment or observation, also a bit of something work in progress, and that we are excited about to see what that may still change, is that data is being reworked to be available on an online portal dashboard, even to shorten still these feedback loops still. So it's exciting, actually, also as a bit of a next step. And with that, I think, Pauline, over to you to facilitate a Q&A.
Thank you so much. Great presentation, and I'm glad we overcame those technological hitches at the beginning. It's very smooth after that. There's clearly a lot of interest in this presentation and the topic. We've got a number of really great questions. I'm going to ask people, if they can, to unmute themselves and come in and just briefly summarize your question. Please try and make it brief, but Anne-Thora won't have been able to read everything that's in the chat there. I'm going to go in the order of the questions that are there, which actually do to some extent cluster quite nicely. I'm going to ask 3 people to give their questions, and then for Anne-Thora and Jeff for you to respond to those. So we are, we've got half an hour, so we've got plenty of time for discussion, but it will be a bit limited given how much interest there is. So if I can ask in this first round for Victoria, Lauren and Ben to be ready to come in with your questions. So Victoria, starting with you. If you can unmute yourself. Looks like you have unmuted yourself, but we can't hear you. In which case I might need to read out what your question is. So Victoria's question, she's got 2 questions there. Sorry, Victoria, we can't hear you, but I think you're trying to come in. Is what is the Zambian Ministry of Education's philosophy? Is it fully on board with the idea that teaching, learning and progressing in education system for all, or does it believe rather that education should filter out less capable children and focus on supporting more capable children's progress? That's about the sort of focus in relation to the Ministry of Education, and I guess sort of how that relates to the TAL, this intervention. And then her second question is, to implement TAL, teachers had to work a lot of additional hours. Were they remunerated by the programme? Did teachers and pupils complain that they have to work more hours, and would they rather farm, attend their livelihoods? Did you have anything along those challenges? I think this relates to some extent to Lauren's question. Lauren, I don't know if you're able to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, I was wondering along the same lines. It seems there's an additional burden for teachers, and I was just wondering about incentives or compensation for them for that additional time. And about the teachers working as enumerators or assessors at these different points. I was just wondering if there's been any issues with that, maybe around bias or their practices or their way they treat children in classes, or perhaps it's enhancing their work. I'm not sure. So just any reflections on that would be great.
Great, thanks. And then Ben's the third one. And sorry, don't worry about answering in the chat because you're going to come back and answer in a second. So Anna, so Ben, would you like to come in? I know you've got a lot of experience of TAL, so great to hear.
Yeah, thanks, Pauline, and hi everyone. Excited to hear about the work in Zambia. So one of my questions is already asked. So the ones that weren't asked were, given that the lessons were outside of the normal class day, what's the attendance rates of kids, and kind of associated with that, what's the kind of progress of kids between levels? It's exciting to see them moving up levels, but how often is that happening beyond the kind of termly assessment? And then the last question is, and I think it's a big one that's going to come to Zambia if it hasn't yet, it's happened elsewhere, which is how has doing TARL affected what happens during the normal school day? So there's a Read Zambia program that's moved into grade 3 very recently, if I understand correctly. And so what is a teacher who's doing this kind of inside of the normal classroom instructional program, how is that interacting with the TARL program in the afternoon, or has it not really come up as an issue yet in grade 3? Thank you.
Thanks so much for those great questions from everybody. Anne-Thora, do you want to come and answer them?
I shall try to remember all of them, but those are great questions. I think the first one from Victoria on, the filtering out of less capable children or the like. I think that as much as the Zambian education system means that, a very small percentage end up going to, colleges, universities and the like, there is full agreement that any time spent in schools should be meaningful. If you have a child that spends 7 years in primary education, you will want that child to acquire foundational skills of, literacy, numeracy by the time they leave primary school. If they go on to secondary school, high school, university, that's great. But even if they do not, with those 7 years of primary education, we would like them to be able to fully participate in society and, acquire knowledge on their own and be able to take part in day-to-day activities. So I think that's something the ministry is very passionate about. But with that said, they are doing quite some automatic promotion to secondary schools now. I don't know the actual term, but there's a lot of children now that are able to go straight into secondary school, even if they didn't pass the final exam in primary school, and there are more secondary schools being opened up. So there is definitely an intention to keep children in school longer than what has been the case in the past. But even then, we have children leaving secondary school that still cannot learn and still cannot read. And we've seen a number of schools actually expanding the catch-up classes to grade 7, 8, 9, even grade 12, and even adult literacy lessons. So it's a huge need, and the ministry is fully on board in terms of making sure that everyone who passes through a school should acquire those skills. The next one, I think, was on the incentives for teachers, which was also from Victoria, Lauren, and I believe Benjamin. I think it was a shared question, and it's a real struggle. We work with ministry employed teachers that are not particularly well paid and not always hugely motivated. But what happens is that, as Jeff was trying to respond in the chat, there's no teacher that enjoys talking to children every day, day in and day out, without seeing any difference. That's really the most demotivating thing you can go through as a teacher. So if you have a solution that actually helps you to see a change and where you can see progress in your learners, we've seen that that is a huge motivator. Of course, that is not going to work for everyone, but we've seen a lot of teachers that are really, thanking the ministry, thanking us when you go into the field for bringing this methodology that has really finally, given them some concrete tools and methods to be able to see a difference in their classrooms. But of course, you always, especially when you introduce the program, it's always, what's in it for us? How often will we have trainings with allowances? Are you giving us any responsibility allowance, which they would get for other tasks? And that's where the ministry ownership is critical, because the ministry comes in and says you have an 8-hour workday. Remedial teaching is part of your core duties. And so there's nothing new here. This is the ministry's chosen approach to remedial learning. And so this is your core duty, and if you do not comply, it's a disciplinary case, which is a tough line, right? So you have the kind of positive motivation, and you also have the administrative action, because this is really considered a mainstream ministry program. So that really helps us. In terms of the pupil attendance, it's always a challenge when you start the lessons. Because some children actually have to wait at school for quite a number of hours before, attending their catch-up class. So it's very important to work with the parents, the communities. If they stay very far away, sometimes they organize school feeding or, something like that to try and help the children that remain. But what we see is, again, that the children really love the catch-up lessons. As I mentioned briefly, there's a lot of learning through play. There are a lot of games. And so, you find that where there's a catch-up class, you very often have a line of children, on the windows looking in, wanting to join because it's considered, a really exciting time. And once the parents understand that this is part of helping them, to learn to read and, how to calculate, to do the operations, they are very supportive as well, because even parents really would like to see the children learning. It does vary depending on, where you are. Some communities have maybe some seasonal fishing, some communities have, so you will have less attendance in the harvesting time or the, cultivation time. So definitely those are issues, but when you look at the year as a whole, we are able to work around it. But we are faced with all the attendance issues that the regular school day faces. We are not immune to those. But we see that the attendance in regular classes and catch-up classes is fairly comparable. So there's no major difference. But this comes down to how the school manages the communication, which is an important piece. I think there was one from Benjamin, which was around attendance, yes, and support. This is a very interesting question, Benjamin, in terms of how it's affecting the regular teaching hours. This is actually something that is part of the research we are doing in Lusaka province to see if there's a spillover effect from the catch-up classes to the regular classes, and if that is also, impacting the social-emotional learning and the learning outcomes more generally. So I will have more evidence-based answers on that, hopefully in the near future. But for now, just anecdotally, what we observe is that we see that teachers are bringing a lot of the concepts, the approaches, just that systematic approach to a lesson, in terms of the lesson planning, in terms of how you, compose a lesson, how you select activities, how you introduce activities, how you interact with the learners. From what we've observed, we do feel that there is that spillover to the regular classes, but we don't have that evidence yet. But we think that there's a change, and we also see some schools that actually, on their own initiative, train all their teachers in catch-up. We typically train, one teacher per grade, like grade 3, 4, 5, plus a mentor. And in some schools, we've seen that they train all their teachers, and they actually start using these activities in grades 1, 2 in the regular classes as well, to lay those foundations. So this is, there's not one answer for all the schools, but in our 3,000 schools, definitely we see this happening in many of them. In terms of interaction with other programs, that's a big discussion. I see Pauline Rose wants to get to other questions. I think I'll pend it. But what we see again with the data, like we had one zone in Chongwe district outside Lusaka province that just had, like phenomenal results. And we were trying to understand, what's happening here. And it turned out that there was a library project with a book club where the children had access to, many more reading materials. And so in combination with catch-up, that was really like a magic combination. And similarly with other programs, you can sometimes see it in the data. For Let's Read Zambia, unfortunately, we haven't really seen that kind of huge difference between Let's Read schools and others. Yes. So
I'm going to have to stop you there because we've got 6 more questions. But these are obviously very stimulating questions, but the next 6 are also stimulating. So there is a bit of crossover between them, and as I've seen in the chat, some people are saying somebody's asked the same question. So please don't feel you have to come in if somebody's already asked it. But in the next cluster of 3, I've got Andy, Sarah, and Anya. So Andy, would you like to come in? Please be brief, and Anne-Thora, if you just be quite brief in your responses, then we'll have time for the last 3 as well. So Andy.
Thanks, Pauline, and thanks, Anne-Thora. Very interesting to hear this. And my question is about, you've mentioned methodology, TAL methodology quite a few times, and you've referred to sort of aspects of it, including lesson planning, culture, teaching style, etc. But I sense that the TAL methodology is actually more about assigning students to different levels according to the assessment. So these are actually quite different notions, different concepts, I think. And I wondered, how do you separate these when you're presenting to teachers and to policymakers, and also have the randomized control trials actually attempted to separate out these effects. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Sarah, I don't know if your question has already been asked or whether you want to come in as well.
Thanks. Yeah, it's an elaboration of Andy's. It's a similar question, but just to point out that the TAL methodology, so-called, is actually a very major intervention with multiple facets, beyond just grouping by level. So yes, teaching materials, but there's the professional learning, there's the learning by play, there's all the different aspects. So yeah, just wondering how you isolate the impact of the grouping by level. Has there been or will there be a controlled experiment where everything will be kept constant apart from the grouping by level?
Great, thanks. And Anya, I think your question also relates.
Hi, yes, thank you. Definitely on a similar theme. I was just wondering, it was great to see all of that data about the impact on literacy and numeracy. And it'd be interesting to know if that data has been disaggregated by gender, if we're seeing differences at baseline, end line, degree of impact of the program at a gender disaggregated level.
So back to you, Anne-Thora, just a few minutes to respond to all of those really stimulating questions as well.
Thank you. So I don't think, well, okay, yes, no, we have not researched whether, just grouping in levels on its own would produce any change, but I don't see how it would if you're then, what are you bringing to those levels? The same curriculum? Because then, of course, that's what's happening in the regular classes, or are you bringing something different? And so the TAL methodology, I believe, is the whole package of, grouping children by the level, but then providing, level appropriate activities, level appropriate content, and creating a welcoming, environment where children's confidence is boosted so that they are able to, meaningfully participate, where you engage every individual child. So I don't think the grouping by levels would be very interesting to single out. Maybe there's other literature I'm not aware of that would suggest so, but from our experience working with the program, if you just group them by levels and then provide the same content would not, wouldn't really make sense. And that's why it's a whole package of, where you have the levels, then you have the lesson planning, you have the activities that are suitable for each level, but maybe I'm misunderstanding the question. I see Sarah raising her hand.
Yeah, sorry, I think it was the opposite I was meaning. If you had all of the innovative pedagogy and teacher learning and so on, and you kept that constant, but you had one condition where you have them, matched by level, and others you have them where you have it mixed. So you can identify the impact of the same level grouping. I see. No, that is not something we have done, but I imagine that, if you have all that content, it means that for the learners in the, for example, story level group or in the 4-digit group, some of that content would be, below their level, and as such, they wouldn't really be challenged further. And then, for the beginners, they might also be exposed to, concepts and content that they would not be able to immediately comprehend. So then I imagine you would have to kind of start chronologically almost, where you kind of start from the lower level content and build up with that mixed approach. It could be interesting, but it's not something that we are thinking of at the moment. But of course, in some schools, I must say, well, yeah, I might have an answer actually. In some schools where we have very few teachers and a lot of learners, we do actually avoid too many levels. But what happens then is that you have some of the sort of, can I say, strong learners that are being used as like assistant teachers. So they would still assess and understand, who is who in the class. And then they would put the stronger students or learners to be, group leaders or to be co-facilitators. And in that way, give them some additional challenges while actually keeping the overall content for a mixed class at a level that works for the average of the group. So that is happening in a lot of the rural small schools, and that works quite well. And what we say, if you can't manage to deliver all the levels, you focus on the beginner level. And then once everyone is kind of like, fully mastering that, then you add the next level and move the whole group together. So those are ways of working around it. And that it's slower than if you can manage all the levels, but it's definitely still impactful.
So have you finished those questions, Anne-Thora?
I think so, unless I'm.
I think let's move on to the next three.
There was one on gender. What we see is that we have better attendance of girls than boys, which is surprising to many because we do the reach, and we have more boys absent than girls. In terms of the results, not yet, but it's something that we are going to look into next year.
Great. So you will be gender disaggregating, which is great. So
on a
last
very
three
small
questions are from Artemio, Debbie, and I'm reordering them slightly because I think Kristen will come in with your question at the end because I think it's a nice one to sum up on. So Artemio, do you want, again, if you could, we've literally got 5 minutes now for the questions and the answers. So you can say your questions in a sentence, that would be great. So Artemio, to you first.
Thank you, Pauline, and thank you, Anne-Thora, for your presentation. Yes, my question, I think, was kind of addressed before in terms of isolating the impact of certain aspects of your project. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Artemio. Debbie?
Yes, my question was about sort of how much time it takes for teachers to develop those locally developed teaching materials, and whether there were complaints or concerns from them about the time that it takes, in that you encounter that with the time that assessment takes. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And then the last question is from Kristen.
Greetings. I'd just like to know, what were the critical points you hit when you were campaigning for funding, considering all the commendable initiatives there are in and around the world for education, focusing on TAL in particular, what is it that won you that funding?
So I thought that was a good question to end on. So Anne-Thora, back to you for those last two questions. Thanks.
Thank you. So I think assessments are considered, it takes some time. If you have 100 learners, times, even if it's 2-3 minutes each one, it will take you some days. So normally we set aside a week for those assessments. But I think, once they appreciate the value of assessments, they're quite happy to do it. And of course, there's a lot of, positive feedback that you get from all levels of the ministry when you do it and do it on time. In terms of the material development, I actually think teachers quite enjoy it, and they typically use, the holiday times to do it together, and they have fun and, have lunch together and make materials. If they are too busy to do that, which we see more in the urban schools, they would ask the parents or community members to help, or even the children themselves. So then they will say, okay, can you bring, sticks? Can you bring stones? Can you make these syllable charts? They look like this. So there are ways around that, and often we see that they ask parents. I think the last one is then on funding, or am I missing a question in between?
That's the last one, yeah.
Great. Well, I think I would not say that we have, arrived where we need to be with the funding. The ministry wants to go to national scale as soon as possible. We are currently in 1/3 of the schools. We have actually reached the last stages of a few funding processes that have been cancelled due to shifts in global priorities quite recently. So we are, on a daily basis, looking for ways to secure more funding to really get to that national scale that the ministry would like to see. In terms of what donors look for, I think a huge one is that this is so well integrated into the ministry systems. This is something that is literally running, through ministry systems. Master trainers are from the ministry, mentors are from the ministry, teachers are from the ministry, and this is happening, as a routine. Is considered a core program. I think that is something that really appeals to partners as, something that started out as a small pilot that has been able to demonstrate impact. Of course, demonstrating impact, having the results, having the data that we have. We have data from 2,700 schools, 500,000 individual learners. That is hugely important, but I think it's really also the ministry ownership and the ministry's determination to bring this to national scale. And I think the ministry is also key to bringing in resources from donors and partners as well. So I think it's really that combination of something that partners perceive to be scalable and sustainable, even with an initial investment, but then a gradual reduction in external support, and something the ministry can take over. So I think that is probably the one thing that I would single out for now.
Excellent. Thank you so much for a fantastic presentation, and clearly has stimulated a lot of discussion. I think for me, this has really helped us to go beyond what is often at the moment this black box of teaching at the right level that we're often hearing about, to some of the more nuances in relation to its implementation, the role of and effects on teachers, etc. And I think there's far more on this discussion that we can continue to have. So, and I think one of the other things is also about how this often, or hopefully does, vary according to context. So what is relevant of teaching at the right level in the sort of black box terminology of how that might be understood and implemented in another context other than Zambia, I think is also worth exploring. So I'd really love to sort of have further discussions about this, because we often to really sort of tease out some of these issues further, bringing together perhaps people who are implementing the programme in different contexts to sort of see how some of these understandings of things we've been hearing about here for Zambia might affect those in other contexts as well. So thank you so much for the great presentation and all the work that VVOB is doing on this, as well as the other partners that you're working with. And we look forward to sort of hearing more from this. There's a number of people in the chat who have really also identified their appreciation for this discussion. So we won't go through, read all of those out, but you'll be able to see Anne-Thora and Jeff, many of those there. And Joe's been coming back on the discussion point that Sarah was having, and further points from the RISE project that have discussed some of these issues. So I think this is a really live debate, and look forward to continuing it. So thank you again for agreeing to be part of this seminar series. The next seminar is next Tuesday at the same time, so 1 o'clock British Summer Time, by Artemio and Emma, so 2 colleagues in the Real Centre, who will be talking about our work in the Leaders in Teaching initiative, of which VVOB is also a partner, looking in particular at the effects of teaching practice and teachers' knowledge on learning outcomes. So please do come for that. It's going to be hybrid. So for those who are in or near Cambridge, you're invited to come in person, or otherwise you can also join online. And the seminar after that is on the following Tuesday by colleagues from Education Sub-Saharan Africa, who will be talking about our work in collaboration with them on the African Education Research Database, and more generally about how to really promote the visibility of research by researchers in Sub-Saharan Africa, and to also enhance funding reaching researchers in Sub-Saharan Africa, and the sort of wonderful work that they've been doing to promote that. So again, that's a hybrid event, and you're welcome to join in person or online. And I think they've been put in the chat there for you to get that further information. So we hope to see you at those, and hopefully the stimulation from this discussion will help us to move forward and further debate these issues. So thank you again, and nice to see everybody. Have a good rest of your day.